The bartender would later say it was the quietest sound he'd ever heard that made the loudest impact. A single piece of metal, no bigger than $50, slapped flat against the oak bar top. And within 4 seconds, 6 grown men at 6 different tables pushed back their chairs and stood at attention. Not a word was spoken, not a command was given. But every former operator in that room knew exactly what they were looking at, and the loudmouth kid who'd been running his mouth all night. His face turned the colour of old ash. If this story hits you where it counts, comment respect before we even get started. Because what this 75-year-old Green Beret did without raising his voice, without throwing a single punch, without saying one angry word, was more devastating than anything that kid had ever seen on a screen, let alone a battlefield. The bar was called the Rampart. It sat at the end of a gravel road just outside of Fayetteville, North Carolina, about 12 miles from Fort Liberty, which most of the regulars still called Bragg out of habit, and a stubborn refusal to let go of what they'd known for decades. The Rampart wasn't listed on any tourist guide. It didn't have a website, it didn't need one. If you knew, you knew, and if you didn't, the place wasn't for you. The walls were covered in unit patches, faded photographs, challenge coins mounted in shadow boxes, and a long row of dog tags hanging from a brass rail above the top shelf liquor. There was a framed American flag behind the bar that had flown over a fire base in Kunar Province in 2005, and next to it was a smaller frame holding a torn piece of fabric from a parachute that had allegedly saved someone's life during a training jump gone wrong at Yuma Proving Ground in 1987. Nobody ever asked whose parachute it was. At the Rampart you didn't ask. You earned the right to be told, or you sat quietly and drank your beer and kept your stories honest. Most nights that system worked perfectly. Most nights the only sounds were the low hum of classic rock on the jukebox, the crack of pool balls, the murmur of men who had seen enough of the world to know that silence was its own kind of language. But tonight was not most nights. His name was Arthur Meechum, though nobody in the bar knew that yet. He'd come in around 7:30, moving slowly, leaning on a dark wooden cane with a brass cap that had been worn smooth from years of use. He wore a plain brown jacket over a flannel shirt, work boots that had seen better days, and a faded green ball cap with no insignia on it. Nothing about him announced anything. He didn't look like a man carrying a story. He looked like what most people assumed he was when they bothered to glance his way at all, which wasn't often. A tired old man at the tail end of a long life, stopping in for a drink before heading home to an empty house. He took a stool at the far end of the bar, the one closest to the wall, and he set his cane against the bar rail and folded his hands on the counter and waited. When the bartender came over, a young woman named Dana, who'd been pulling shifts at the Rampart for about 3 years, Arthur ordered a single bourbon, neat, mid-shelf, nothing fancy. He said please and thank you, and that was it. Dana poured the drink and moved on. Arthur Meechum became invisible. At the centre of the bar, holding court at a high-top table surrounded by 3 or 4 younger guys who were half listening and half checking their phones, was a man named Kyle Durgin. Kyle was 34 years old, broad-shouldered, with a high and tight haircut that he maintained religiously, even though he'd been out of the army for nearly 5 years. He wore a black t-shirt with a Spartan helmet logo on it, the kind you could buy at any gas station near a military base, and he had a tattoo on his left forearm that said Molen Labe in block letters. Kyle came into the Rampart about twice a month, always on a Friday, always loud, always buying rounds for whoever would listen and always telling stories. The problem with Kyle's stories was that they didn't hold up under any kind of scrutiny, and everyone at the Rampart who'd actually been somewhere knew it. Kyle had served 4 years in the army. He'd been a supply specialist at Fort Hood. He'd never deployed. He'd never heard a shot fired in anger. He'd never been within 2,000 miles of a combat zone. But to hear Kyle tell it, you'd think he'd personally led the raid on bin Laden's compound. He never made that specific claim outright, but he talked in circles that were designed to leave that impression, dropping references to my time downrange and when we were running ops, and things I can't really talk about, you know how it is. He peppered his stories with just enough jargon to sound credible to civilians, and just enough vagueness to avoid getting pinned down by anyone who actually knew the language. It was a performance, and Kyle had been doing it long enough that he'd started to believe his own script. Tonight Kyle was in rare form. He'd had 4 beers and 2 shots of Fireball, and his voice had climbed to a volume that carried across the entire bar. He was telling a story about a supposed night mission somewhere he wouldn't name, in a country he couldn't specify, involving a team he wasn't allowed to identify, and the details were so generic and so Hollywood that a few of the older regulars at the bar had already exchanged glances and gone back to their drinks with the silent agreement that the kid wasn't worth the energy it would take to correct him. That was the culture at the Rampart. You didn't call someone out unless they crossed a very specific line. Bragging was obnoxious but tolerable. Claiming valor you hadn't earned? That was the line, and Kyle had been tap dancing on it all night. "So we're stacked on the door, right?" Kyle said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, leaning forward with both hands flat on the table like he was briefing a platoon. "And the team leader gives the go signal, and I'm second man in the stack and we breach, and the room is hot. I mean hot, and I'm putting rounds." He stopped himself, shook his head, waved his hand. "I can't get into it. You know, classification." One of the younger guys at the table nodded seriously, as if classification protocols were something he understood intimately and respected deeply. Another one took a drink and looked away. At the far end of the bar, Arthur Meechum took a slow sip of bourbon and said nothing. It was around 8:15 when Kyle's performance started to shift from generic bluster to something sharper. One of the guys at his table, a man in his late 20s named Pete, who'd actually done 2 tours in Afghanistan as an infantryman with the 82nd Airborne, finally spoke up. Pete was quiet by nature, not the type to start confrontations, but Kyle had been pushing buttons all night, and Pete had reached a limit he didn't know he had. "Hey Kyle," Pete said, keeping his voice level and his eyes on his beer. "What unit were you with again?" The table went quiet. Kyle blinked once, twice. "What do you mean, what unit?" he said, his voice still loud but suddenly carrying a different edge. "I told you, man. I can't really—" "I'm just asking what unit," Pete repeated, still not looking up. "Regular army stuff. MOS. Where you were stationed. That's not classified." Kyle's jaw tightened. He took a drink of his beer to buy time, then set the bottle down hard. "Third group," he said. "Special Forces. I was attached." Pete looked up for the first time. "Attached," he repeated. The words sat in the air between them like a live wire. At the Rampart, attached was a word that meant everything or nothing depending on how it was used. Attached to a Special Forces unit could mean you were a support element, a translator, a logistics coordinator. It could mean 100 legitimate things, but the way Kyle said it was designed to imply something else entirely. "Yeah," Kyle said, straightening up, crossing his arms over his chest. "Attached. We did some real work, the kind of stuff that doesn't make the news." Pete said nothing for a long time. Then he nodded slowly, looked back at his beer, and muttered something under his breath that nobody at the table quite caught. The moment passed. Kyle took it as a victory and launched into another story. This one about a bar fight in Kandahar that sounded suspiciously like a scene from a movie that had come out 2 years ago. Arthur Meechum heard all of it. He'd been sitting at the far end of the bar for nearly an hour now, nursing the same bourbon, and he'd heard every word Kyle had said. His expression hadn't changed. His hands hadn't moved. He sat with the stillness of a man who had spent large portions of his life in places where stillness meant survival, where the ability to remain motionless and alert for hours wasn't a skill, but a prerequisite for breathing the next day. Arthur had a face that told a story if you knew how to read it. Deep lines around his eyes, the kind that came from decades of squinting into sun and wind and things that burned. A thin white scar along the left side of his jaw that disappeared under his ear. Hands that were large and scarred and steady despite his age. The kind of hands that had done things they would never talk about. He wore no rings. He carried no phone. The only personal item visible on him, besides his cane and his cap, was a slight bulge in the inner breast pocket of his jacket, something small and heavy resting against his chest. He'd been listening to Kyle Durgin the way a man watches a storm he knows is going to pass, with patience and a kind of distant, tired recognition. He'd seen 100 Kyles in his life. 1,000. Young men who confused volume with valor and stories with service. They were as common as dust in places like this, and Arthur had long ago stopped feeling anger toward them. What he felt was something closer to sadness, because every fabricated war story was an insult not to him, but to the men who couldn't tell theirs. The men who'd stayed behind in jungles and deserts and frozen mountain passes. The men whose names were carved into black granite, or etched into headstones at Arlington, or scattered in the memories of families who still set an empty plate at Thanksgiving. But then Kyle said something that changed the temperature in Arthur Meecham's chest. It happened around 8:30. Kyle was deep into another story, his voice booming, his gestures broad and theatrical, and he was describing what he called the worst night of my career. He talked about a helicopter going down in hostile territory. He talked about dragging a wounded teammate through enemy fire. He talked about calling in air support on his own position because they were about to be overrun. And then, with the kind of dramatic pause that only someone who'd rehearsed it could pull off, he said the name. He said the name of an actual operation. A real one. One that had been partially declassified 4 years ago. One that had made the rounds on military podcasts and documentary channels. One that had enough publicly available detail for someone like Kyle to cobble together a convincing imitation of having been there. The operation was called Burning Pine. It had taken place in Laos in 1971, during a period of the Vietnam War that the United States government had publicly denied involvement in for decades. It involved a 12-man Special Forces team that had been inserted across the border to disrupt North Vietnamese supply lines along a tributary of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. 9 of the 12 men on that team came home, 3 did not. The mission had been classified for over 40 years before portions of the after-action reports were released under a Freedom of Information Act request. It had been a bloodbath. It had been heroic beyond anything Hollywood could manufacture, and it had been real. Kyle Durgin had read about it online. He'd watched a YouTube video about it, and now he was telling a bar full of people that he'd heard about it from a guy who was there, which was his way of borrowing the gravity of the event without technically claiming he'd participated. But the way he told it, with first-person details that didn't match the public record, with embellishments that turned a tragedy into an action movie, with a casual disregard for the men who'd actually bled on that mission, made it something worse than lying. It made it theft. Arthur Meechum set his bourbon down. His hand didn't shake. His expression didn't change. But something behind his eyes shifted. Something that Dana the bartender noticed from 10 feet away without understanding what she was seeing. She would later describe it as the moment the old man stopped being old. Not physically. He didn't suddenly sit up straighter or puff out his chest. But there was a change in his presence, as if the air around him had become denser, as if gravity worked differently in his immediate vicinity. Arthur reached into the inner breast pocket of his brown jacket slowly, deliberately, with the economy of motion that comes from decades of training in which every movement serves a purpose and no energy is wasted. He pulled out a small object wrapped in a piece of dark cloth. He set it on the bar in front of him. He unwrapped it carefully, folding the cloth back with the precision of a man handling something sacred. And then, without a word, without looking at anyone, without raising his voice or changing his posture, Arthur Meechum picked up the coin and slapped it flat on the bar top. The sound was small, a single metallic crack against old oak. It shouldn't have carried, but in the split second before it happened, there had been a natural lull in the room's noise, one of those accidental silences that occur in crowded spaces when conversations briefly align in their pauses, and the sound of that coin hitting the bar cut through the room like a rifle shot. Every head turned. Every conversation stopped. Dana froze with a bottle of Jameson in her hand. Kyle Durgin stopped mid-sentence with his mouth still open, and 6 men at 6 different tables, men who had been sitting quietly all evening, men who had not drawn attention to themselves, men who ranged in age from their early 40s to their late 60s, did something that nobody in that bar expected. They stood up, not casually, not curiously. They pushed back their chairs and rose to their feet and stood at attention, shoulders back, chins up, eyes forward, hands at their sides, 6 men, 6 tables, all at once. The whole thing took less than 4 seconds. The bar went absolutely, completely, terrifyingly silent. Kyle Durgin looked around the room with an expression that cycled through confusion, irritation, and the first flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time, which was genuine fear. "What the hell?" he said, but his voice had dropped to half its usual volume, as if the silence in the room had physically compressed it. Nobody answered him. Nobody even looked at him. Every eye in the room was on the coin. The coin was unlike any challenge coin most people had ever seen, and most people in that bar had seen a lot of challenge coins. Challenge coins are a tradition in the military, small medallions bearing a unit's insignia, carried by members as proof of affiliation, and used in rituals of camaraderie and respect. Every unit has one, every service branch. Some are common, some are rare, some are so restricted in their distribution that possessing one is itself a statement that requires no further explanation. Arthur Meechum's coin was in the last category. It was heavier than a standard coin, thicker, with a dark patina that spoke of age. On one side was an emblem that most people in the room didn't recognize, a spearhead overlaid with 3 lightning bolts, and a Latin phrase that none of the younger patrons could translate. On the other side was a single number, no name, no unit designation, just a number, and below it, 2 words that made the 6 standing men go rigid. Burning Pine. This was not a commemorative coin. This was not something you could buy on eBay or find at a military surplus store. This was an operational coin, minted in a batch of 12, one for each member of the team that had crossed into Laos in 1971 and fought their way through hell for 72 hours. Only 9 of those coins had ever come back, and one of them was sitting on the bar at the Rampart under the scarred, steady hand of a 75-year-old man in a brown jacket. The 6 men who were standing didn't need anyone to explain this to them. They recognized the coin not because they'd seen one before, but because they were the kind of men who understood what it represented. They were former operators, not the kind Kyle Durgin pretended to be, the real kind, the quiet kind, the men who'd spent years in units whose names they still didn't say in public, who'd done things in places that would never be acknowledged, who carried their own coins in their own pockets, and understood the weight of what it meant to put one on a bar. In the challenge coin tradition, slamming a coin on the bar is a challenge. It means, show yours or buy the next round. But what Arthur Meechum had just done was something different. He hadn't just issued a challenge, he'd made a statement. He'd placed on that bar top a piece of history so rare, so heavy with sacrifice, that standing was the only appropriate response for anyone who understood what they were looking at, and 6 men understood. The first to stand had been a man in his early 60s sitting alone at a corner table. His name was Frank Correa, and he'd spent 22 years in the army, the last 14 of which had been with units that didn't appear on any organisational chart. Frank had a coin of his own in his right front pocket, and his right hand was resting on it now, not to pull it out but to feel its weight, to ground himself in the reality of what he was witnessing. The second was a man named Davis, early 50s, sitting with his wife, who looked confused and slightly alarmed by her husband's sudden movement. Davis had been a Marine raider before transitioning to a joint special operations unit, and he hadn't stood at attention in 8 years, but his body remembered how, the way a body always remembers the things that were beaten into it with purpose and repetition. The third and fourth were together, 2 men in their 40s who'd served in the same unit in Iraq and Afghanistan, and had come to Fayetteville for a reunion weekend. They didn't know Arthur Meechum. They didn't need to. They knew the coin. The fifth was a retired sergeant major named Willis, who ran a landscaping company now and hadn't told his employees what he'd done before mowing lawns, and who had tears forming in the corners of his eyes as he stood. The 6th was a woman. Her name was Torres. She was 47 years old, and she'd spent 12 years in Army Special Operations as a cultural support team member, attached to units conducting direct action raids. She'd been in rooms that didn't exist, in countries she'd never name, and she recognised the emblem on that coin because she'd seen it once before, in a briefing room at a facility she wasn't supposed to remember, on a slide that had been classified at a level so high that acknowledging its existence was itself a violation. Torres stood at attention with the same precision and stillness as the 5 men around her, and her eyes were locked on Arthur Meechum with an expression of profound respect. Kyle Durgin watched all of this happen with the dawning comprehension of a man who has just realised he's been swimming in the shallow end of a pool that has no bottom. His mouth was dry. His hands, which had been gesturing so broadly 5 minutes ago, were flat on the table in front of him. The 3 or 4 guys who'd been sitting with him were looking round the room with wide eyes, trying to understand what was happening. Pete, the 82nd Airborne veteran, was the only one at Kyle's table who understood, and he was sitting very still with his jaw clenched, not standing because he hadn't been an operator and knew the difference, but feeling the weight of the moment with every cell in his body. "I don't," Kyle started, and his voice cracked, actually cracked like a teenager's, and he cleared his throat and tried again. "I don't understand what's—" "Then be quiet." The voice came from Frank Correa, the 60-year-old in the corner, and it wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was the kind of quiet that has mass, the kind of quiet that a man develops after decades of issuing commands, in situations where being heard wasn't about volume but about authority. 2 words, and Kyle Durgin's mouth closed like a trap. Arthur Meechum still hadn't turned around. He was still facing the bar, his hand still resting on the coin. Dana the bartender was standing directly across from him, and she could see his face, and what she saw made her breath catch. He wasn't angry, he wasn't smug, he wasn't performing. His eyes were wet, not crying, not yet, but wet in the way that eyes get when the past rushes up through decades of careful containment and presses against the walls you've built to keep it manageable. Arthur was not thinking about Kyle Durgin. He was thinking about 3 men whose names were etched on that coin along with 9 others. He was thinking about Sergeant First Class David Morano, who'd taken a round through the throat on the second night and had still managed to drag himself 40 metres to cover the team's flank before he bled out. He was thinking about Staff Sergeant Leland Red Cooper, who'd called in the extraction coordinates while enemy rounds shredded the canopy above his head and who'd been hit 3 times and kept transmitting until his voice cut out and never came back. He was thinking about Sergeant Tommy Bann, 23 years old, the youngest man on the team, who'd stayed behind at the river crossing to hold a position that everyone knew was indefensible, so the rest of the team could make it to the extraction point. Tommy Bann, who'd grown up in a Vietnamese immigrant family in Sacramento, and had joined the army because he believed in something bigger than himself, and had died proving it in the country his parents had fled. Arthur hadn't spoken Tommy's name out loud in 11 years, but he thought it now, in the silence of the Rampart, with his hand on a coin that was warm from his body heat and heavy with 54 years of memory, and he felt the word in his chest like a heartbeat. Slowly Arthur turned on his stool. He moved the way he always moved, carefully, using the bar for support, his cane still resting against the rail. He didn't look at Kyle. He looked at the 6 people standing at attention in the room, and he gave them a single slow nod. The kind of nod that carries gratitude and recognition and shared understanding. One by one, the 6 sat back down. Torres was the last. She held Arthur's gaze for a long moment before she resumed her seat, and in that moment something passed between them that neither would ever need to verbalize. Then Arthur looked at Kyle. He didn't glare. He didn't sneer. He looked at him the way a teacher looks at a student who has gotten the answer wrong in a way that matters, not with contempt but with a weary kind of clarity. "Son," Arthur said, and his voice was quiet, calm, roughened by age but steady as a compass needle. "I don't know what you did in the service, and I'm not going to ask." Kyle opened his mouth, but nothing came out. "What I will tell you," Arthur continued, "is that the operation you were just talking about, Burning Pine, was not something you heard about from a guy who was there. You heard about it from a screen, and the details you were sharing were wrong. The extraction wasn't by helicopter, it was by boat. There was no air support called on our position because there was no air support available. We were denied. We fought our way to the river on foot in the dark, carrying 2 dead and 1 dying. The word "our" detonated in the room like a concussion grenade. Our, not their, not the team's. Our. Kyle Durgin's face went through a transformation that several witnesses would later describe as the moment he aged 5 years in 2 seconds. The colour left his cheeks. His jaw went slack. His eyes widened and then narrowed and then widened again, as the full weight of what he was hearing settled onto him like a physical load. He was looking at a man who had been there, not a man who'd read about it, not a man who'd watched a documentary, a man who had crossed into Laos in 1971 with 11 other men and had fought for 72 hours and had carried his dead through the jungle and had lived with the silence of that mission for over 50 years. Arthur Meechum was Burning Pine. He wasn't telling a story. He was the story. 3 men on my team didn't come home, Arthur said, and now his voice did something that made Dana the bartender grip the edge of the bar to steady herself. It didn't break. It didn't waver. It descended, dropping into a register so deep and so controlled that it felt like the room itself was leaning in to listen. Their names were David Morano, Leland Cooper, and Tommy Bann. David had a wife and a daughter in Columbus, Georgia. Red had a mother in Tulsa who never stopped writing him letters even after she got the notification. Tommy was 23. He'd never been on a date. He lied about it, told us he had a girl back home, but we knew. We all knew. Arthur paused. He picked up his bourbon, took a sip, set it down. Those 3 men are the reason I'm sitting here. They didn't die so that someone could turn their mission into a bar story to impress people who don't know any better. They died because they believed in something, and they honoured that belief with everything they had, including their lives. Kyle Durgin was staring at the floor. His shoulders had come forward, curling inward, as if his body was trying to make itself smaller. One of the guys at his table had quietly gotten up and moved to the bar. Another one was looking at his phone, not reading anything, just looking at it because he didn't know where else to look. Pete, the 82nd Airborne veteran, was sitting motionless with his hands wrapped around his beer, his eyes fixed on Arthur Meechum with an expression of absolute unguarded reverence. "I'm not going to tell you what to do," Arthur said. "I'm not your father, I'm not your commanding officer, but I will ask you one thing." He paused. The whole bar waited. "If you're going to tell war stories, tell your own. If you don't have any, that's fine. Most people don't. That doesn't make you less of a man. But borrowing someone else's sacrifice to make yourself feel bigger, that makes you less of a man. And the men in this room who stood up just now, they didn't stand for me. They stood for the coin. They stood for what it represents. They stood for Morano and Cooper and Ban and every other name that's ever been carved into a wall that shouldn't have needed to be built." Arthur picked up the coin from the bar. He wrapped it carefully back in its dark cloth and returned it to his breast pocket, pressing it gently against his chest as if he were tucking something alive and fragile back into safety. Then he turned back to the bar and took another sip of bourbon. The silence in the Rampart lasted another 30 seconds, which in a crowded bar on a Friday night is an eternity. Then quietly conversations resumed. The jukebox, which someone had paused at some point without anyone noticing, started playing again. Johnny Cash singing about walking the line. Dinah poured Arthur another bourbon without being asked and refused to let him pay for it or anything else for the rest of the night. Frank Correa, the 60-year-old former operator, walked over to Arthur's end of the bar. He didn't speak. He simply placed his own coin on the bar next to Arthur's empty glass, face up, showing an emblem from a unit that also didn't officially exist, and gave Arthur a nod that was returned with the same slow gravity. Then Frank picked up his coin, put it back in his pocket, and returned to his table. Within the next 10 minutes, 3 more of the 6 who'd stood came to the bar. Each one placed their coin down for a moment. Each one received a nod. Each one walked away without a word. It was a ritual as old as the tradition itself, a silent communion between people who had walked through the same fire in different places and at different times, but who shared a bond that civilians would never fully understand, and that no amount of lying could ever replicate. Kyle Durgin left the Rampart around 9 o'clock. He didn't say goodbye to anyone. He didn't finish his beer. He walked out with his head down and his hands in his pockets, and when the door closed behind him, nobody watched him go. But something happened about a week later that made this story something more than just an old man putting a young liar in his place. Pete, the 82nd Airborne veteran who'd been at Kyle's table that night, ran into Kyle at a gas station. Pete was filling up his truck and Kyle was inside paying for a drink, and when Kyle came out and saw Pete, he stopped. He didn't walk away. He didn't pretend he hadn't seen him. He stood there on the concrete in the afternoon sun with a bottle of water in his hand, and he said, "I owe you an apology." Pete shrugged. "You don't owe me anything." "Yeah, I do," Kyle said. "I owe a lot of people an apology. I've been lying about my service for years. I was a supply specialist at Hood. I never deployed. I never saw combat. I never did anything close to what I've been claiming." Pete was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why are you telling me this?" Kyle looked at the ground. "Because that old man at the bar didn't just embarrass me. He showed me what the real thing looks like, and the real thing is quiet, and it hurts, and I've been making noise to cover up the fact that I'm ashamed I never got to be part of it." Pete didn't know what to say to that, so he said the truest thing he could think of. "You served. 4 years in the army is 4 years more than most people give. You don't have to make it into something it wasn't to be proud of it." Kyle nodded. He didn't seem convinced, but he seemed like a man at the beginning of a process rather than the end of one, and Pete respected that enough to leave it alone. Arthur Meechum continued to come into the Rampart on occasional Friday evenings. He always sat at the same stool at the far end of the bar. He always ordered the same bourbon, neat, mid-shelf. He always said please and thank you to Dana, and she always poured his second drink on the house. He never told another war story. He never brought up Burning Pine again. He didn't need to. The coin sat against his chest in its dark cloth, warm from his body, heavy with names that he carried every day the way Atlas carried the sky. Not because he wanted to, but because putting it down was never an option. The 6 men and women who'd stood that night continued to come to the Rampart too, and though none of them ever made a show of it, there was always a nod when Arthur walked in, a slight raise of a glass, a moment of recognition between people who had given large parts of themselves to something they believed in and who understood, in the marrow of their bones, that respect isn't something you claim, it's something you earn, one silent, steady, unborrowed day at a time. Frank Correa eventually introduced himself to Arthur one night, properly, with a handshake and a first name and nothing else. They sat together at the bar for 2 hours and talked about fishing. Not once did they mention the military. Not once did they compare deployments or swap stories. They talked about bass and trout and the best time of year to fish the News River, and when they parted ways that night, Frank told his wife it was the best conversation he'd had in years. She asked what they talked about. He said fishing. She waited for him to say more. He didn't. She'd been married to him long enough to understand what that silence contained. Torres came to the bar one Friday night about a month after the incident and found Arthur sitting at his stool. She walked up to him, set a small wrapped package on the bar and said, "My grandmother made this. It's a rosary. She wanted you to have it." Arthur looked at the package, then at Torres. "She doesn't know me," he said. "She knows the kind of man who carries his people with him," Torres said. "That's enough." Arthur unwrapped the rosary carefully, held it in his scarred hands, and pressed it briefly to his forehead before placing it in his pocket alongside the coin. "Tell her thank you," he said. Torres nodded and walked away. The Rampart didn't change much after that night. The jukebox still played classic rock. The pool ball still cracked. The dog tag still hung from the brass rail above the top shelf. But Dana noticed something different. The stories people told at the bar got quieter. Not fewer, not less passionate, just quieter. More honest, more careful with the weight they carried, as if every man and woman who'd been there that night had been reminded of something they'd always known but had maybe started to forget, that the truest stories are the ones told in the lowest voices, and the greatest heroes are the ones who never wanted to be called heroes at all. Arthur Meechum's coin stayed in his breast pocket, wrapped in its dark cloth, resting against the heartbeat that had carried it home from a jungle in Laos 54 years ago. 3 names, 12 men, 9 who returned, 1 coin on a bar, and a room full of people who understood, finally and completely, that respect is not a word you type in a comment section or shout across a crowded room. It is a life you live, quietly, faithfully, every single day. If this story reminded you that real strength doesn't need to raise its voice, subscribe to this channel. We tell the stories of the men and women who carried the weight so the rest of us could walk free. Subscribe if you believe that honor isn't loud, and share this with someone who needs to hear it.